A villager only discovered who his guest was after a month. He sang a song in English and suddenly, he did those moves. That's when we knew, says the village chief. Michael Jackson had chosen the most unexpected place in the world to escape from the paparazzi, lawsuits, and the pressure of his fame, a village in the heart of Africa whose name doesn't even appear on most maps. If these kinds of stories catch your attention, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Where are you watching us from right now? Let us know in the comments below. In late 2005, Michael Jackson disappeared from public view. After his acquittal in his highly publicized trial that June, the King of Pop had fled the United States, seeking refuge first in Bahrain as a guest of Sheikh Abdullah bin Hamad Al Khalifa, then briefly in Ireland and France. The world's media, having scrutinized his every move for decades, suddenly lost track of his whereabouts for weeks at a time. But perhaps the most mysterious of Jackson's post-trial escapes was his secret journey to a remote village in Gabon, West Africa, a story that has received little attention even among devoted fans. The journey began in early 2007, according to multiple sources close to Jackson during that period. Disillusioned with celebrity life and deeply traumatized by his legal troubles, Jackson was seeking something increasingly rare in his extraordinary life: anonymity and genuine human connection. Michael talked about wanting to experience Africa in a real way, recalls one former security team member who was aware of the trip's planning but did not accompany Jackson. Not as a celebrity visiting a charity with cameras following him, but as a regular person. He had this idea that in a remote village, he could find some peace and maybe connect with people who wouldn't judge him. The seeds for this unusual journey had actually been planted years earlier. During his 1992 Dangerous tour, Jackson had visited several African countries, including Ivory Coast and Tanzania. Though these were standard celebrity visits, complete with security details, official receptions, and photo opportunities, something about the continent had resonated deeply with him. After that tour, he often spoke about Africa with a kind of longing, remembered one longtime associate. He talked about the music, the rhythms, the connection to something ancient and authentic. But he was frustrated that he couldn't experience it properly because of who he was. Everywhere he went, he was Michael Jackson first and foremost. This frustration intensified during his 1999 charity work in South Africa. While visiting a children's hospital in Johannesburg, Jackson reportedly slipped away from his entourage for nearly an hour, causing momentary panic among his security team. They eventually found him in a ward for infants, holding and feeding a baby, completely absorbed in the task and seemingly at peace. "That's when I think the idea really took root," said the associate. He realized that in moments where people were focused on something other than his celebrity, like those nurses concerned about their patients, he could briefly experience something genuine. The logistics of such a trip for someone of Jackson's fame presented enormous challenges. How could the most recognizable face in entertainment possibly blend into a rural African community? The solution involved an elaborate plan of misdirection, fake itineraries shared with his usual staff, and a skeleton crew of just 2 trusted security personnel who had been with Jackson for years. One of these security team members, whom we'll call Robert to protect his identity, later shared details of the planning with a small circle of trusted associates. According to Robert, Jackson initially wanted to travel entirely alone, a proposal that was gently but firmly rejected as too dangerous. "We had to convince him that even without the concerns about his fame, traveling completely solo as a foreigner in remote areas carried real risks," Robert explained. "The compromise was that he would have minimal security, just me and one other team member, and we would maintain a discreet distance whenever possible." Jackson traveled under a pseudonym, reportedly using the name Joseph Scriven, a nod to the composer of the hymn, "What a Friend We Have in Jesus," which Jackson had loved since childhood. He carried minimal luggage, abandoned his usual elaborate disguises, and dressed simply in lightweight clothing appropriate for the tropical climate. In preparation, Jackson grew a light beard, something his fans had rarely seen, and let his hair return to its natural texture. He wore simple eyeglasses rather than his customary sunglasses. The transformation wasn't elaborate, but combined with the contextual unlikelihood of Michael Jackson appearing in a remote African village, it proved remarkably effective. The village that would become Jackson's temporary home lies approximately 90 miles from Libreville, Gabon's capital. Its name has been deliberately withheld from most accounts to preserve its privacy, though several sources refer to it as Mbing or a similar name. With fewer than 200 inhabitants, no electricity, and accessible only by a dirt road that becomes virtually impassable during heavy rains, it represented the antithesis of Jackson's usual environment. How Jackson selected this particular location remains somewhat mysterious. One account suggests that a humanitarian worker whom Jackson had met during his charity efforts connected him with a local guide. Another version claims that the village had familial connections to one of Jackson's security team members. What's clear is that very few people knew of Jackson's whereabouts during this period, with most of his staff and even family members believing he was in Tokyo or London during these weeks. The village chief, identified only as Père Dominique in most accounts, had been informed that an American visitor would be staying in the community but was not told of Jackson's identity. Instead, he was told that Joseph was a writer or humanitarian worker seeking to learn about traditional African life. A small guest house typically used for visiting medical workers was prepared for Jackson's arrival. According to those familiar with the trip, Jackson arrived in Gabon on a private jet but transferred to a nondescript vehicle for the final journey to the village, arriving at dusk to minimize the chance of being recognized. For the villagers, the arrival of any foreign visitor was unusual but not extraordinary, as the region occasionally hosted anthropologists, aid workers, and missionaries. The journey to the village itself became an adventure that Jackson reportedly found exhilarating. After leaving the main highway, the road deteriorated into little more than a dirt track through dense forest. During the final miles, heavy rain had created deep mud that forced the travelers to abandon their vehicle and proceed on foot, guided by a local man with a lantern. Michael was like a kid on an adventure, Robert recalled. Wading through mud, getting soaked by rain, things that would have sent him into a panic in Los Angeles. But there, it was all part of the experience. He kept saying, "This is real. This is really real." When he first arrived, people were curious but respectful, says Jean Ondino, a Gabonese journalist who later investigated Jackson's visit after rumors began circulating in Libreville. They thought he was maybe unusual looking, but they had no context for who Michael Jackson was. Most had never seen a television. They just thought he was a light-skinned American with some unusual features. That first night, exhausted from travel but visibly energized by the adventure, Jackson was welcomed with a simple meal of fish, plantains, and local greens. He sat on a wooden stool in Père Dominique's compound, surrounded by curious but polite villagers who asked simple questions about America through an interpreter. Jackson, careful to maintain his cover, spoke in generalities about American life while asking numerous questions about the village and its customs. He was immediately interested in the music, recalled one villager later interviewed by Ondino. When some of the young men brought out drums after dinner, his whole posture changed. He became very focused, watching their hands, listening to the rhythms. He asked if he could try, and though he was not skilled with our specific drums, we could see he understood rhythm in a deep way. This first night established a pattern that would continue throughout Jackson's stay, genuine curiosity about local customs paired with a deliberate restraint regarding his own musical abilities to avoid revealing his identity. Jackson's daily life in the village represented a radical departure from his normal routine. Without electricity, his days followed the natural rhythms of sunrise and sunset. He slept on a simple cot with a mosquito net in a mud brick house with a tin roof. He drew water from the village well, took bucket showers, and ate meals prepared over an open fire. The absence of modern amenities, far from disturbing Jackson, seemed to provide unexpected freedom. There were no phones, no assistants, no business demands, no paparazzi, none of the constant pressures that had defined his existence since childhood. For perhaps the first time in decades, his schedule was determined not by professional obligations or public appearances but by the natural rhythms of community life. The first few days, he seemed almost in shock, Robert observed. Not in a negative way, but like someone who suddenly found themselves in zero gravity after a lifetime of carrying heavy weights. He kept saying how quiet it was, how there was space to think and just be. For perhaps the first time since early childhood, Michael Jackson experienced life without being recognized, without being pursued, without being Michael Jackson. According to those who have pieced together his time there, he participated in village life with unexpected enthusiasm and adaptability. He helped with small tasks. He tried to learn words in the local dialect. He spent hours with the children, teaching them games. Ondino reports from his interviews with villagers. There was a simplicity to his interactions that surprised the community. He seemed genuinely interested in their lives. Within days, Jackson established a routine that would have been unrecognizable to those who knew him in his celebrity life. He rose with the sun, often joining early morning fishing expeditions to a stream that ran near the village. These excursions became a particular source of joy, despite his initial clumsiness with the traditional fishing methods. One villager, identified only as Antoine in accounts of Jackson's stay, recalled teaching Jackson how to fish in the nearby stream using traditional methods. He was not very good, Antoine reportedly said with a laugh. But he tried very hard. He was like a child learning everything for the first time. On one memorable occasion, Jackson reportedly stood thigh-deep in the stream for nearly 2 hours, concentrating intensely on the technique Antoine had demonstrated. When he finally caught a small fish, his celebration was so exuberant, jumping and shouting with joy, that he scared away all the fish in the vicinity. Rather than being annoyed, the other fishermen found his enthusiasm endearing and genuine. He apologized for scaring the fish, but could not stop smiling, Antoine recalled. He carried that small fish back to the village as if it were a great treasure. The incident illustrated something that villagers frequently noted about their visitor, a childlike quality that manifested not as immaturity but as a capacity for joy and wonder that many adults had lost. This quality made him particularly appealing to the village children, who quickly overcame any initial shyness around the foreign visitor. The children of the village formed a particular connection with Jackson, unaware of his global fame as the performer who had sold millions of albums with songs like Beat It and Billie Jean. To them, he was simply Joseph, the American visitor who knew many games and songs. Jackson reportedly taught them ring games and simple English songs, while they taught him their traditional dances and local children's games. One activity became a daily ritual, a game of soccer played in the village clearing each afternoon. Jackson, despite his slender frame and lack of athletic background, participated with unexpected energy and dedication. He was not skilled, villagers recalled him frequently tripping over his own feet or missing easy passes, but his willingness to make himself vulnerable and even ridiculous in the pursuit of fun endeared him to both children and adults. There was a freedom in his interactions with those children, observes Dr. Aisha Reynolds, a psychologist who has studied celebrity isolation and has reviewed accounts of Jackson's African retreat. Without the weight of being Michael Jackson, without the history of allegations and suspicion that had come to surround his interactions with children in the United States, he could simply be an adult spending time with kids in a natural, community context. This freedom extended to other aspects of village life as well. Jackson participated in communal meals, sitting on the ground with others and eating with his hands from shared dishes. He attended a village wedding celebration, joining in traditional dances despite his initial awkwardness with the specific movements. He spent evenings listening to elders tell traditional stories around fires, absorbing the oral history of the community with evident fascination. Throughout these activities, Jackson maintained his cover as Joseph with careful discipline. When conversations turned to music or dance, he expressed appreciation as a knowledgeable fan rather than a practitioner. If asked directly about his own musical abilities, he would claim modest skills, enough to teach music to children in America, but nothing professional or noteworthy. This deception required constant vigilance. On several occasions, Jackson caught himself just before performing a signature move or vocal riff that might have revealed his identity. During one evening of drumming and dancing, he became so caught up in the rhythm that he nearly executed a perfect moonwalk before stopping himself and deliberately stumbling to cover the slip. He was always catching himself, Robert noted. Sometimes mid-gesture or mid-note, he'd suddenly shift to something more ordinary. It was like watching someone constantly translating themselves into a different language. For nearly 4 weeks, Jackson's identity remained his secret. He avoided singing his known hits or performing his signature dance moves. When asked about his life in America, he kept details vague, describing himself as a music teacher or sometimes as a songwriter. Most villagers, with little or no access to global media, had no reason to question this identity. As the weeks passed, Jackson visibly relaxed into village life. The constant tension that characterized his public appearances, the careful control of his image, movements, and words, gradually diminished. He laughed more freely, moved more naturally, and engaged more spontaneously with those around him. It was like watching someone thaw, Robert observed. Each day, there was less performance and more person. This evolution was particularly evident in Jackson's physical health. The chronic insomnia that had plagued him for years, and that had led to his problematic use of prescription medications, seemed to improve dramatically in the village environment. Without artificial light to disrupt natural circadian rhythms, and with days filled with physical activity and social engagement, Jackson began sleeping soundly through the night. He told me he hadn't slept so well since he was a child, Robert recalled. No pills, no special arrangements, just genuine tiredness at the end of a full day. Similarly, Jackson's eating habits, which had been notoriously erratic and restricted in his celebrity life, normalized during his village stay. Sharing communal meals created a social pressure to eat regularly, while the limited availability of food eliminated the possibility of skipping meals or making special requests. To everyone's surprise, including his own, Jackson adapted quickly to the local diet and began to gain healthy weight. His face filled out, Robert noted. His energy improved. Even his skin seemed clearer and healthier. It was remarkable what just a few weeks of normal living did for him physically. The revelation of Jackson's true identity came about accidentally, according to multiple accounts. During an evening of community singing and dancing around a fire, a regular occurrence in the village, Jackson was encouraged to share music from his homeland. After initially hesitating, he performed a rendition of "We Are the World," the charity single he had co-written with Lionel Richie. As he sang, he unconsciously incorporated some of his characteristic moves, the precision hand gestures, the subtle weight shifts, the unmistakable Michael Jackson performance instincts emerging despite his efforts to suppress them. Père Dominique, the village chief, had once seen a Michael Jackson music video years earlier while visiting Libreville. As he watched Joseph perform, a connection suddenly formed in his mind. "That's when I knew," Père Dominique later told Ondino. "The way he moved was not like other people. I had seen this on a television long ago. Our visitor was the famous singer. The moment was electric." Père Dominique observed Joseph carefully throughout the remainder of the performance, noting the distinctive vocal techniques and precise movements that had made Michael Jackson instantly recognizable worldwide. Yet he said nothing, allowing the evening to conclude without revealing his realization. Rather than immediately exposing Jackson's identity to the entire village, the chief approached him privately the next day. According to this account, he assured Jackson that his secret would be respected if he wished to maintain his anonymity. Jackson was reportedly moved to tears by this discretion. In a rare moment of complete trust, he confirmed his identity to the chief but asked that the information be shared only with village elders, not the community at large or the children with whom he had formed bonds. "He told me he had found peace here," Père Dominique recalled. "He did not want that to change because of his name." The chief honored this request, gathering only the village elders, men and women in their 60s and 70s who helped govern community affairs, for a private meeting where he revealed their guests' true identity. The elders, most of whom had little concept of global pop culture, received the information with remarkable equanimity. They asked practical questions, Père Dominique explained. Was he in trouble? Was he hiding from authorities? When I assured them he was simply seeking privacy and peace, they agreed to maintain the secret. This moment marked a unique turning point in Jackson's relationship with the village. With the elders now aware of his identity but honoring his wish for anonymity, a new layer of authenticity entered his interactions with them. He could speak more openly about his life experiences while still maintaining his cover with the broader community. In the evenings that followed, Jackson occasionally joined the elders for private conversations after most villagers had retired for the night. In these intimate gatherings, he gradually shared elements of his extraordinary life, his childhood in the spotlight, the pressures of fame, his creative process, and his deep loneliness despite being surrounded by millions of admirers. The elders listened as they would to any visitor sharing their story, Père Dominique recalled. They offered no judgment, only the wisdom of their years and experience. They treated his pain as they would anyone's, as part of the human journey, neither more nor less significant because of his fame. This simple acceptance, the recognition of his humanity rather than his celebrity, proved profoundly healing for Jackson. According to Robert, after these evening talks, Jackson often returned to his quarters visibly lighter, as if unburdened of weights he had carried for decades. For the remaining days of his stay, Jackson continued as Joseph to most villagers, though with a new layer of understanding between himself and the community's leaders. This arrangement allowed him to maintain the freedom and normalcy that had drawn him to the village while being more authentic with those in positions of trust. What makes this episode particularly notable in Jackson's complex life story is not just its obscurity but what it reveals about his deepest needs and struggles. For a man who had lived in the spotlight since childhood, who had achieved wealth and fame beyond imagination, the simple life of an anonymous visitor in a remote village provided something his millions could not buy: ordinary human interaction. In that village, Michael found the most valuable thing possible for someone in his position: people who connected with him as a person, not as an icon or a commodity, suggests Reynolds. The psychological value of that experience can't be overstated. As his planned departure date approached, Jackson reportedly became increasingly reluctant to leave. He explored the possibility of extending his stay or even purchasing land near the village where he might establish a simple retreat. Practical considerations, his ongoing financial obligations, professional commitments, and concerns for his children's education, ultimately made these ideas impractical. Instead, he focused on making his remaining days in the village as meaningful as possible. He spent extra time with the children who had become his regular companions, teaching them new games and songs. He participated more actively in community projects, helping to repair the roof of a community building damaged in a recent storm and assisting with the construction of improved water collection system. In his final days in the village, Jackson also organized what he called a cultural exchange. He arranged for instruments to be delivered from Libreville, drums, guitars, and small keyboards, which he presented to the community. Then, with the approval of Père Dominique and the elders, he offered to teach interested villagers some American music while learning more of their traditional songs. This exchange culminated in an extraordinary evening of music that those present would later describe as magical. With the secret of his identity still known only to the elders, Jackson taught simplified versions of American folk songs and spirituals, deliberately avoiding his own compositions, while village musicians taught him their traditional rhythms and melodies. As the night progressed, something remarkable happened: the two musical traditions began to merge and transform. Jackson, drawing on his professional expertise but still maintaining his cover as Joseph, helped blend African rhythms with American melodies, creating unique fusions that delighted both him and the villagers. It was not Michael Jackson the star performing, Père Dominique recalled. It was a genuine collaboration between musicians from different worlds finding common ground. The music they created together existed only in that moment, for those present. It was perhaps the purest musical expression of his time here. Jackson's departure from the village was as low-key as his arrival. According to accounts, he left gifts for various community members, practical items like tools and cooking equipment, rather than money or extravagances that would have disrupted village life. For the children, he allegedly left musical instruments, simple drums and flutes purchased in Libreville before his departure. Before leaving, Jackson reportedly had one final conversation with Père Dominique and the village elders in which he expressed his gratitude for their hospitality and discretion. According to one account, he told them, "You have given me something I haven't had for many years, you let me be a normal person." In return, the elders presented Jackson with a simple wooden carving, a traditional figure representing a traveler, and performed a brief blessing ceremony for his journey. The gesture moved Jackson deeply. Robert recalled that it was one of the few occasions when he had seen Jackson cry without trying to hide his emotions. The departure itself happened before dawn, with only Père Dominique and a few elders present to say goodbye. As Jackson prepared to leave, a small group of children, awakened early or perhaps never having gone to sleep, appeared unexpectedly to bid farewell to their friend Joseph. That was the hardest moment, Robert remembered. The children were crying, and Michael was struggling to maintain his composure. He kept promising to return someday, though I think he knew even then that it would be impossible. As the first light of dawn broke over the village, Jackson climbed into the waiting vehicle and began the journey back to his complicated life as Michael Jackson. According to Robert, he was silent for much of the drive, occasionally looking back in the direction of the village until it disappeared from view. Jackson's return to celebrity life happened gradually. From Gabon, he traveled to Senegal, then to South Africa, where he began reconnecting with his regular security team and staff. By the time he returned to the United States several months later, the African village experience had become another closely guarded chapter in his closely guarded private life. Yet the impact of those weeks as Joseph remained evident to those closest to him. Several associates noted subtle but significant changes in Jackson's behavior and outlook following his return from Africa. He expressed greater interest in simplifying aspects of his life, reducing his entourage, and spending more focused time with his children away from public scrutiny. Most notably, Jackson's dependency on prescription medications, which had been increasing steadily in the years before his African journey, temporarily diminished. For several months following his return, he made concerted efforts to manage his insomnia through natural methods similar to those he had experienced in the village: regular daily activity, consistent meal times, and reducing artificial light in the evenings. He talked about how he had slept better in Africa than he had in years, recalled one associate. He kept saying, "It's not the place, it's the way of living." He really tried to recreate elements of that simplicity when he came back. These positive changes, unfortunately, proved difficult to maintain in the context of Jackson's complex life. Financial pressures, legal disputes, and the perpetual scrutiny of the media gradually eroded the sense of peace he had briefly found in Africa. By late 2008, as preparations for the This Is It concert series intensified, many of his old patterns had reasserted themselves. The story of Jackson's time in Gabon remained largely unknown during his lifetime. After his death in 2009, several of those with knowledge of the trip began sharing details, though always with careful consideration for the privacy of the village and its inhabitants. Jean Ondino's investigation, published in a regional French-language publication in 2010, provided the most comprehensive account, though it too omitted specific identifying details about the location and full names of villagers involved. According to Ondino, the village has seen a small increase in visitors curious about its connection to Jackson, but local authorities have generally discouraged such tourism out of respect for the community. What makes this story particularly poignant is how it contrasts with the public narrative of Jackson's life during this period. While tabloids portrayed him as increasingly eccentric and isolated in the years following his trial, he was, at least for a brief time, experiencing perhaps the most grounded and authentic human connections of his adult life. Michael spent his whole life performing, always aware he was being watched and judged, says one former associate who was among the few aware of the Africa trip. In that village, for a few weeks, he wasn't performing. He was just living. I think it was possibly the freest he'd felt since he was 5 years old. For the villagers, the revelation that their guest had been a global superstar was met with a remarkably measured response. According to Ondino's reporting, many expressed surprise but maintained that it didn't change their impression of Joseph, whom they had come to know as a kind, somewhat childlike man eager to participate in their daily lives. "He carried water, he ate our food, he played with our children," one village elder reportedly said. Famous or not, that is how we judge a person. In the years following his return from Africa, Jackson occasionally referenced the experience in private conversations, though never in media interviews. One security team member recalled Jackson speaking wistfully about the simplicity of village life and expressing a desire to someday return or perhaps create a similar environment where he could live more simply. This desire manifested in concrete ways during the planning for Jackson's ill-fated "This Is It" tour. According to individuals involved with the production, Jackson had inquired about the possibility of including African musicians and incorporating authentic African musical elements into the show. He had also explored the idea of dedicating a portion of the tour proceeds to development projects in rural African communities, with specific mention of improving water access and educational facilities. The tragedy, of course, is that Jackson never got that chance. His final years were consumed by financial troubles, preparation for what would have been his comeback tour, and the escalating health issues that would ultimately lead to his death in June 2009. Yet the story of his secret time in Africa provides a unique window into what Jackson valued and sought beneath the extraordinary trappings of his public life. Beyond the gold records, beyond the record-breaking tours and controversial headlines, was a human being seeking the most fundamental forms of connection and authenticity. "I think we need to understand Michael's time in that village as a kind of seeking," suggests Reynolds. Here was someone who had achieved everything in material terms, who had been adored by millions, but who still felt a profound emptiness. What he found in that community was what many of us take for granted: simple human recognition and acceptance. For the children of the village, many now adults, the realization that their playmate, Joseph, had been Michael Jackson came years later, as increasing access to global media reached their community. According to Ondino, many expressed amazement but also a certain pride that the famous performer had chosen their community and had connected with them so genuinely. One village child, now a young man, told Ondino, "We taught Michael Jackson our games. Sometimes I see him dancing on a video, and I think maybe there is a little bit of our village in how he moves." This touching observation points to another significant aspect of Jackson's African experience, the possibility that it influenced his art in subtle ways. Those familiar with Jackson's creative process noted that following his return from Africa, he expressed interest in incorporating more organic elements into his music, fewer electronic sounds, more acoustic instruments, and rhythmic patterns reminiscent of traditional African music. Several previously unreleased compositions discovered after Jackson's death, presumably created in the 2007 to 2009 period, contain elements that some musicologists have identified as influenced by West African rhythmic traditions. While Jackson never publicly acknowledged these influences or their specific source, those aware of his time in Gabon have suggested a direct connection. "He absorbed everything around him like a sponge," observed one producer who worked with Jackson in his final years. He never explicitly talked about Africa as an influence, but there were new rhythmic patterns in some of his demos, different ways of approaching percussion that hadn't been part of his previous work. The story of Jackson's secret African sojourn has particular resonance when considered alongside his public charitable work on the continent. While his philanthropic efforts in Africa, supporting hospitals, orphanages, and aid organizations across multiple countries, received media attention and public recognition, his personal, private connection to the continent through this unpublicized visit suggests a deeper relationship than mere celebrity charity. For a man whose identity had been shaped by performance since childhood, whose every move had been calculated for public consumption, the opportunity to simply be present, without cameras, without expectations, without the burden of being Michael Jackson, represented a unique form of freedom. "I think Michael was searching for his authentic self," reflects one former confidant. "When you've been performing since you were 5 years old, the line between the performer and the person becomes blurred." In that village, he had a chance to rediscover the person behind the performance. The village in Gabon has reportedly maintained a respectful silence about their famous visitor in the years since his death. According to the most recent accounts, a small, private memorial, a simple wooden structure with no explicit connection to Jackson, was erected in the community space where he once sang and danced with village children. It bears no name, no image, only a message in the local dialect that roughly translates to, "A friend who reminded us that we are all the same under the sky." This modest tribute perhaps best captures what Jackson found in this unexpected place, not adulation or celebrity, but simple human recognition of a shared humanity. For a man whose extraordinary talent and fame had paradoxically isolated him from ordinary human experience, those few weeks as Joseph, in a village whose name doesn't appear on most maps may represent one of the most authentic chapters in a life otherwise lived in the unrelenting glare of the spotlight. In the complex, often troubled narrative of Michael Jackson's life, his secret time in Africa stands as a testament to his search for connection beyond fame, a brief moment when the king of pop found what perhaps he had been seeking all along, the simple freedom to be himself, recognized not for his talent or his celebrity, but simply for his humanity.